Alright, let's continue taking a look at the major laws of apartheid. Forced removals and the creation of the townships. The Natives Resettlement Act of 54 and the Group Areas Development Act of 55. And so we moved from these large big cities like Johannesburg, Pretoria, and the goal was to remove all non-whites from the cities. But it's never that easy. A lot of the cities had onderdorp, or mixed population areas, and black spots, or African communities that would be in the middle of white suburbs. And so it's not going to be a completely white area surrounded by black townships. Instead, it's kind of it's got some polka dots going on here. And apartheid government wasn't having that. And so the Natives Resettlement Board was created to coordinate the removal of these committees, or of these communities. Sophiatown is the big example. This was the largest black spot community, surrounded by working-class Afrikaners. This was settled before a lot of these laws were passed, settled before the Native Lands Act of 1913. And also, it wasn't part of city control. Therefore, this town was legally owned by African residents, one of the very few areas that Africans could actually own the land because they owned it before the laws were passed. So it became a center for culture as there started to be illegal nightclubs popping up. There started to be a jazz scene. A lot of Americans would visit to play Sophiatown. Also a center of political protests. It's next to the big city. It's a black-owned area. And so the African National Congress, the ANC, would meet and use this area for protests. Government was having none of that. So January 1955, we get the forced removal of Sophiatown residents. 65,000 residents are forced to load their belongings on government trucks. And as they're loading all their stuff, they watch their homes be bulldozed over, and their entire town is just flattened. Residents are moved to what becomes the massive Soweto Township on the edge of Johannesburg. There was a resistance campaign led by an Anglican priest, Trevor Huddleston, and with help from Nelson Mandela and Ruth First, but it just didn't work out. And so here we have a child playing in front of what was Sophiatown. When it's squashed, it becomes and they rebuild to become the new Afrikaner town of Triumph on top of it. Once they're kicked out, they are moved to other areas. And so refugees had to report to the Resettlement Board. They would be given just basic supplies and moved to new homes built by the government. These township homes were sometimes known as matchboxes, in that they were just built in rows. They had the same exact architecture, same plan, nothing unique about them. There were no toilets, at least inside. You have to have an outside outhouse. And you'd have no running water, so you have to kind of go get water outside of the house. These were designed for 7 to 14 people, so sometimes huge families would just be jammed into one of these little boxes. And they became horribly overcrowded. They were very hastily constructed. The planning was terrible on this. The sewer system was not well designed to handle this amount of people. You had long commutes, hours just to get to work, poor sanitation with the sewer system, very few hospitals or police stations to help anybody that was sick or in trouble, and without a strong police presence, gangs started to take over. So we started to get Tsotsis. These are urban gangsters taking over in the townships, become common sight. Schools were very sparse and very overcrowded. To make things worse, and so these are the government-built houses. A lot of people moved in from the native reserves looking for jobs in the town, and so they would set up shanty towns along the edges of the township. So if this wasn't crowded enough, then people start to literally build just little shacks out of whatever materials they can find on the edges of the township. Speaking of education, the last one, let's take a look at the messed up Bantu Education Act of 1953. Schools, under this law, schools had to admit students of only one racial group, so no more mixing. The Native Affairs Department would be controlled the education of all Africans, headed by apartheid hardliner H.F. Verwoerd, who would later on become Prime Minister. Separate school boards were developed for each race. So each race would have a specific curriculum for that race, based on what the board thought was intellectually appropriate and practical for the given race. And so if they thought that one race couldn't handle advanced mathematics, they would dumb it down. Or if they thought, what's the point in teaching a kid that's just going to go work in the mines, they would dumb it down. And so the African curriculum was very much dumbed down. It only covered basic things like literacy. They would learn how to read, basic math, and to allow students to enter very low-skilled jobs as domestic servants for whites or to work in the mines. But full education, they weren't getting it under this system. Very much unequal in its pay. So looking at school funding, for every $7 that was spent on a white student, only $1 would be spent on a black student, resulting in pretty messed up black schools. African children would attend school daily in 3-hour shifts. So you get 3 hours, that's it. No books or materials, so students would often, and sometimes the teachers as well, they would write on the ground with sticks. They didn't have paper or pencil or anything to work with, so they'd learn their ABCs with sticks and dirt. A lot of teachers, because of the low pay, a lot of black teachers quit, and eventually 85% of teachers in these black schools had no professional certification. But with the very low quality of education, frankly, they didn't need it just to teach ABCs and basic math. That's all they were getting. Attempts to further develop tribal identity. So this one's good and bad. Attempts to further develop tribal identity with the mother tongue was used in primary school. So they'd learn their specific tribal language at the elementary school level, and later on they transition to speaking Afrikaans and some more rare cases English. A lot of black parents were very angry and they wanted English as the main language because they saw that as the best opportunity. And I'll come back to kind of why they were teaching the local languages like Zulu and such. The ANC led a boycott of the Bantu schools in '55. Verwoerd threatened to shut down schools that participated in the boycott. Parents were worried because they wanted to at least have some education for their kids. So Verwoerd compromises with a curriculum that tones down the emphasis on tribalism and just their singular language like Zulu, and ANC backs off. One of the main leaders, Steve Biko, who we'll talk about later, said the education system was designed to dehumanize. He responded with the Black Consciousness movement to combat racial self-hatred, and with slogans like "Black is beautiful." So here's a little quote from him: "The most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed," and that these schools are teaching kids that it's not okay to be black. Education with an emphasis on tribal identity. In the view of the grand apartheid view, education with an emphasis on a unique tribal identity helped to allow the tribes to develop separately, and so that they would have just their singular tribe on their own little land. The downside to this is this prevents the growth of African nationalism across communities, in that it separates the tribes rather than uniting them against the government. Zulu tribalism, because they're taught so much to just be their tribe and only their tribe and not South African, Zulu tribalism of the Intanka Freedom Party led to violence between African communities that almost derailed democracy in the 90s. So when they finally got democracy, there was a bit of hatred between the tribes because of the way they were raised. Bantu education, it did not work. It made things horrible. Increased crime, increased poverty, and a generation of people that really had no hope of advancement through education. It also extended to the universities, the Extension of University Education Act. All universities were also required to only admit a single race. So African universities, they took it a step further and said you can only admit a single tribe. And so a lot of universities are shut down. Some new ones are built, but it does really limit what's available for the larger community. A lot of professors are pretty angry and resign in outrage. The Bantustan System, the system of different lands in which they were shipped off to in the native reserves. So this is the main part of grand apartheid, the goal of segregation until they almost get kicked out of their own country. So black peoples across South Africa would be given their own self-governing homeland. And so if you were part of the Zulu tribe, you'd be shipped off to the Zulu area, and basically you would form your own government in that area, and eventually become independent as your own country, an own Zulu country. Eventually all black people would live in these homelands, and South Africa would only have white people, and all black people would live in these really, really tiny little homelands. That's kind of the overall goal, eventually kick everybody out. So here's how they plan to do it. The Bantu Authorities Act created new regional governments in the reserves. And so each of these areas would have their own government. They got rid of the old government that they had some representatives in parliament. Now instead, each of these areas will have their own government. Under the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, they divide the population into 8 groups. Later on, they expanded it into 10 groups. Each group was assigned a white commissioner general to help them transition. They transition over the course of about 10 years until they build their own government, write their own constitutions, and have their own government in their own lands. And once they do have that government set up, the South African government starts to take a hands-off approach to say, hey, black political rights aren't a thing in South Africa anymore because they have the right to vote in their own lands. And so you don't get to complain about voting rights in South Africa because if you are Zulu, you have the right to vote in Zulu territory. By 1970, all black South Africans are declared to be citizens of the homelands and not of South Africa. So if you're black, you are no longer a citizen of South Africa. You're only really a citizen of that small little tiny chunk of land. Therefore, they became foreigners in their own country and could be treated as foreigners and didn't have the same rights as citizens. And so, according to the government, these Bantustans are this great opportunity for them to set up their own government, but really it's just banishment onto the worst areas of South Africa and really into crowded little zones. Bantustan started to become fully independent in the 1970s, but it just never worked. The people that were in charge were often corrupt puppet leaders that were just assigned by the government. It wasn't necessarily by the will of the African peoples. Foreign relations and security was still controlled by South Africa, so they couldn't make foreign treaties, and they couldn't set up their own army because what happens if they all come together and fight against the whites? So they couldn't set up their own army, so they're not really a country. Plus, the rest of the world didn't really recognize these Bantustans as countries. They saw what they were doing and said, no, that's not a country, that's not a thing, stop trying to make that a thing. Bantustan System. Okay, continuing with this, South African employers, and therefore, because they're kicked out, could treat Africans as foreign workers not covered by their laws. So they could pay their workers much lower, and if the workers protested, it's much easier to fire them because they're not citizens, and they can just deport them back to the Bantustans. The Bantustans became horribly crowded, 13% of the land for 55% of the population. They are constructed very quickly and poorly. They're not made to handle that amount of people. Plus, they got the worst land, so poor soil was made worse if you jam all these people in for overgrazing, over-farming, so the soil just gets worse. Plus, the population really wasn't there to develop the economy. Most of the population was the really young and the really old. There wasn't really a working class population of working age because most of those people went to the cities where the jobs were. Just if you jam everybody in a corner, you're not necessarily going to get a good city or an economy moving, especially if there are better jobs somewhere else. So the government saw this and said, okay, let's try to develop this a little bit further. So the Bantu Investment Corporation Act. This encouraged businesses to move closer to the Bantustans to use the cheap labor. So the idea was to maybe move factories right next to the Bantustans so it's an easy commute, and so that they could take advantage of these really cheap workers. Yeah, it didn't work. Nobody wanted to move their factories, and because they already had a workforce that was leaving the Bantustans. There's one weird exception, and it's still there. It's a nice resort, is Sun City. It was a casino and a resort in Bantustan, and it's still there. It was originally kind of a sin city. It was Vegas and Tijuana and Havana all combined, and so it's an odd thing. If you can see this resort, it's in the movie Blended with Adam Sandler. There's Terry Crews being delightful. And it's very ironic in that the homelands were designed to save Africans from the sins of the city. But in many cases, white South Africans would go to Sun City to see and to gamble and sin their little lives away. And so it's, hey, you try to take them out of the city and then they bring the city right back in. Other repressive laws. So some examples, the Suppression of Communism Act. Like many laws, it goes way beyond what it actually says. It made the Communist Party of South Africa legal. This is a Cold War thing. They're freaking out about communism. But the way that they defined communism was anybody that's against apartheid, therefore is a communist, and we can attack them. And so anybody that attacks the apartheid system, they can be charged as a communist. Any person involved in activities related to communism was subject to banning orders. That means they were not allowed to travel to take part in any meetings. And so if they were caught, if they were accused as being a communist and banned, if they were caught meeting with anybody else that's been banned, off to jail. And so this was a very successful method to isolate ANC leaders, that they couldn't actually meet with each other or call each other because of this banning system. Another nasty one is the Public Safety Act of 1950, and this allows the government to just suspend the Constitution and declare a state of emergency, which they do in the aftermath of the Sharpeville massacres, and they get military rule for a bit. Some other examples of these laws meant to hold back the people for government security. The Criminal Law Amendment Act, severe penalties for acts of civil disobedience against apartheid. So it's one thing to burn, to not show up with your passbook, but if you burn your passbook in public, they're going to have severe penalties. You might be in jail for a couple of years for burning your ID. General Laws Amendment, created in response to the creation of the Mkhonto weSizwe, the armed branch of the ANC. So the ANC decided, all right, let's get weapons, let's have a revolution. And they started to commit acts of sabotage, blow up things. The government says, okay, if you blow up anything, any act of sabotage, that's now a capital offense. It doesn't matter if you actually kill anybody, but if you blow up a post office, you get the death penalty. And so it's, again, taking things pretty far. Alright, and that was a look at the major laws of South Africa. Next week we'll look at how people fought against these laws.